Hello there. In the 1930s, J.R.R. Tolkien decided to write a story about the magical land of Middle-earth, home to hobbits, wizards, goblins, and trolls. And it's impressive how it still manages to enchant many readers and filmmakers over the years. Last week saw the release of the first big-screen adaptation of The Hobbit, but Tolkien's titles have been adapted for the cinematic form a good number of times over the years. Not surprisingly, different directors have tried to adapt the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Rumor has it Walt Disney was at one point interested in making an animated film, but decided it would have been too difficult. Tolkien hated Disney films, though, so he probably would not have gotten the rights anyway. The Beatles wanted to star in an adaptation with Stanley Kubrick directing, but he thought the book was unfilmable, and Tolkien hated the idea anyway. John Boorman, the director of Deliverance, was going to make a film adaptation of Lord of the Rings that actually added more sex to the story, but ultimately never came to be. Meanwhile, Ralph Bakshi was a huge fan of Tolkien's work and for years had wanted to adapt it. After making a name for himself as director on X-rated animated features like Fritz the Cat and Heavy Traffic, he entered the fantasy phase of his career and was able to convince producer Saul Sands to give him the reins. Some people are mixed on Bakshi's The Lord of the Rings, but I think it's a solid take on the story. In an unusual decision, he decided to rotoscope the characters, and while some look odd, it works most of the time, even if it is a lazy way of animating. Almost all the characters are their expected heroic or evil selves, with Frodo being that hobbit we root for, and Aragorn being that mysterious fighter. The only exception is Samwise Gamgee, who is completely ruined here by turning him into I don't know what. Otherwise, I felt Bakshi did a very good job of handling the battle sequences and presenting a great atmosphere to Middle-earth. Admittedly, the Fellowship of the Ring section of the film flows better than Two Towers, which occasionally spats of slowness. However, this is a well-done depiction of the material and worth a look, even if I don't like it as much as the later live-action adaptations. Bakshi had wanted to adapt Return of the King and name this Lord of the Rings Part 1, but the studio thought nobody would pay to see half the film. The result was audiences leaving the film in confusion as to why there was no ending. While the film did decently at the box office, Bakshi went on to make other projects, and Rankin Bass adapted the Return of the King themselves as a television special. That's a shame, as I would have liked to see Bakshi finish his version of The Lord of the Rings. One young man who greatly enjoyed Ralph Bakshi's adaptation of Lord of the Rings, to the point where he read the books and became an even bigger fan of Tolkien's, was an aspiring filmmaker from New Zealand. For years, Peter Jackson thought about doing his own film version of the story, and when his remake of King Kong originally fell through, he set up a deal with New Line Cinema to make the three films simultaneously and quite possibly one of the riskiest decisions in film history. Shot entirely in New Zealand on a budget of about $300 million, this could have been an utter embarrassment of a failure. Instead, Jackson's passion for the material allowed it to become one of the most impressive achievements in filmmaking and one of the greatest film trilogies of all time. Starting off with The Fellowship of the Ring, from the get-go is already a great fantasy film. It tackles all the classic ideals of good versus evil, but Peter Jackson does it in a way that feels strangely new, even if so many people have copied Tolkien's original text over the years. I really like how each character is dealing with different turmoils, and on recent viewings, I've really appreciated how fleshed out Aragorn is. Of the massive cast of actors, each film has its own MVP who ultimately stands out among the pack. In Fellowship, it's Viggo Mortensen who gives my favorite performance. Him dealing with the mistakes of his ancestry and trying to make it right is done with a strong amount of depth. Of course, on a technical level, it's very impressive, from the special effects to the sound design to the cinematography to Howard Shore's music. The immense imagination in bringing this world to life, with only Tolkien's words to guide them, shows how talented and dedicated this crew was. There's also a lot to appreciate in an editing standpoint. Despite its 3-hour running time, the time just goes by to the point where it feels you've been sitting down for about an hour, and the same would hold true for the subsequent 2 installments. The first chapter was a great film, and I feel it only gets better from here. The Fellowship of the Ring introduced this world, while The Two Towers has the difficult task of breaking the characters up and still making the story cohesive, and boy, does it deliver. Through its fast-moving 3 hours, Peter Jackson carefully devised the multiple stories in a cohesive whole, each one given the right time to develop and expand on its characters. The Frodo-Sam-Gollum triangle shows the power of the ring on the young hobbit and his connection to the one most affected by it. The relationship between these three is so well explored, and in particular is Frodo grappling with the ring's power. There's an odd sort of kinship with Gollum that shows how more vulnerable he's becoming. Unbeknownst to him, he's becoming more and more like his sickly guide. Not to mention, Andy Serkis is definitely the standout in The Two Towers, further showing the Academy's ridiculous rules that denied him a nomination. The Gollum-Smeagol argument alone was worthy of consideration. The battle at Helm's Deep is exciting and never misses a beat, and never growing dull and tiresome. Aragorn is still the incredibly awesome action hero we saw in Fellowship, but is again still dealing with his past. It ties in nicely with the theme of war and uniting that this chapter is about. With a massive force threatening to destroy the world, it takes man and elf to unite and save the day. The importance of coming together to stop a single evil force was obviously written by J.R.R. Tolkien, show the nations uniting helped stop those seeking to destroy the world in the Second World War. However, it could easily be applied to any war, and Jackson is nicely subtle in delivering that message, both at Helm's Deep and the newfound friendship between Merry and Pippin and Treebeard. Overall, this delivers the right level of strong fantasy, timeless characters, strong action, and technical wizardry that have made the Lord of the Rings films so special. And now we reach the conclusion of the trilogy, and my favorite in the series, The Return of the King. Now the stakes are at the highest, and it's hard not to be gripped when Frodo and Sam make their way to Mordor. For this final chapter, Sean Astin really gets his chance to shine, as you can really tell his loyalty to Frodo more than ever, and while Frodo may get a lot of the credit, Sam is just as instrumental for saving Middle-earth. Of course, the battle sequences are absolutely fantastic, with the special effects continuing to improve, as weather was given more resources to complete Peter Jackson's vision. Like in the previous two films, each character is given enough development and attention so that when it cuts away to somebody else, you're not waiting patiently for it to get back to, say, Frodo or Aragorn. Being the finale, The Return of the King had to be completely rousing, and boy does it succeed. Jackson manages to tap into every single one of our emotions, and considering how long we've spent with the characters, even a single line manages to hit a nerve. They've grown so much since Fellowship in a believable way, and here, their abilities are truly put to the test. Now, people have jokes about the multiple endings here, but I think they're essential, and we deserve to say goodbye to each and every one of them with the most important details. After sitting through 9 hours of their adventures, they deserve an amazing send-off. In the end, it becomes just as much Sam's story and Aragorn's story and Gollum's story as it is Frodo's and Gandalf. What Peter Jackson has accomplished is an amazing achievement that few other directors have accomplished. These are incredibly special films that will live for many decades to many generations, much in the same way the likes of King Kong, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and the original Star Wars trilogy have. Well done, you intrepid Kiwi. Ever since The Lord of the Rings ended in 2003, people have been wondering if The Hobbit would soon be adapted for the big screen too. What followed was years of legal problems with original rights owners, issues with payments, Peter Jackson having a falling out with New Line Cinema and then making up with them, and at one point Guillermo del Toro was going to direct. After he dropped out due to the constant production delays, Jackson decided to return to Middle-earth himself and finally bring The Hobbit to the screen, and shooting once again started in New Zealand. Needless to say, nerds of the world waited in anticipation. Originally, it was going to be 2 films, and then he decided to make it 3 films during post-production. He also decided to shoot it in 48 frames per second, rather than the usual 24 frames per second. Nonetheless, in Peter Jackson we trust, and soon, with ticket in hand, I saw The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey on opening day. And what did I think? Adapting a 300-page book into 3 over 2.5-hour length films sounds like a daft idea. And while there are a couple of scenes that could have used some snipping, Peter Jackson nonetheless did a great job of bringing The Hobbit to the screen. Like the Lord of the Rings film trilogy, a lot of the appeal here is in the expansive world of Middle-earth. It's so wonderful to see it again, with the grand sweeping shots of New Zealand and characters we've grown to really like, notably Gandalf, Gollum, and of course, Bilbo Baggins. Martin Freeman captures Bilbo so well and allows him to be a very real character you want to follow through this now massive journey. All the dwarfs are enjoyable, but the standout is Thorin. Much like Viggo Mortensen came almost out of nowhere to create an excellent riveting character of Aragorn, so does Richard Armitage with Thorin. The technical areas are fantastic, and though I didn't see this in 3D 48 frames per second, which could be considered a disadvantage depending on who you ask, I still marveled at the majesty on the screen. I last read the book 11 years ago, and though my memory is spotty on it, the chapter Riddles in the Dark has always stuck with me. I was so happy to see it brought so brilliantly to life, as perfectly aided by Andy Serkis' immortal portrayal of Gollum. Just seeing him again brought smiles. However, not all returning characters brought smiles, and that might be the biggest flaw here. With the immense popularity of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Jackson does seem to fall into fan service. A prologue with Frollo is unnecessary, and they spend a little too much time in Rivendell spouting exposition just so we can see Gladendriel and Saruman again. Had those scenes been cut, the flowing would have been even better, and this would have been just as good as, at least, Fellowship of the Ring. However, being only a slight step down from my least favorite, the original trilogy, is still a grand accomplishment.